I stood outside in the cold, clutching the small invitation card in my hand, ignored by the very people who had once promised me I was part of the family. "Just wait outside, we'll call you in if there's room," my aunt had said, her voice dripping with condescension as she ushered others into the grand estate. My cousin's engagement party was well underway inside, filled with laughter and crystal chandeliers, while I stood by the gate like an afterthought. I was about to leave until the palace doors creaked open and a voice called out, loud and clear, "Your Highness, we've been expecting you." Every head turned, and in that moment everything changed. Before we continue, let me know in the comments, have you ever been excluded by your own family only to rise above it all? Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of sweet, satisfying revenge. I had always sensed there was something peculiar about my life, an invisible thread pulling me toward questions no one seemed willing to answer. Growing up with the Wellingtons, a proper but emotionally distant couple, I often felt like I was living someone else's life. They provided for me, food on the table, clothes on my back, and education at decent public schools. But love was something I only saw in movies. They weren't cruel, just detached. I remember asking once, "Can I call you Mom and Dad?" They looked at each other awkwardly, then calmly replied, "It's best you just use our names, Alara." That was the first time I realized I was different. As I grew older, those feelings intensified. I had no memories before the age of 5. No baby pictures, no birth certificate, only a sparse adoption file stamped confidential. Every time I brought up the past, Mr. Wellington would find a reason to leave the room, and Mrs. Wellington would smile tightly and say, "Some things are better left buried, dear." But that never satisfied me. Everything changed the day I received the letter. It was a cool spring morning. I was sipping tea and scrolling job boards after another week of rejection emails when a knock sounded at the door. Outside, a well-dressed courier handed me an envelope, thick cream, colored, sealed with crimson wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. I nearly laughed, assuming it was some elaborate junk mail. But when I opened it, the words inside made my pulse race. "Miss Alara Wren, your presence is formally requested at the midsummer ceremony held at Blackvale Estate. Attire, formal, arrival, precisely 3:00 p.m. Saturday." There was no RSVP. No return address, just that one impossibly elegant card. I read it a dozen times. Was it a prank, a mistake, but something about it called to me. I couldn't explain why, but I had to go. Saturday arrived, and I took the earliest train to the countryside. The air changed as the city faded, greener, cleaner, more alive. By the time I reached the remote village near Blackvale, a sleek black Rolls Royce was waiting. The driver, dressed in white gloves and a stiff uniform, held the door open wordlessly. The Blackvale estate looked like something out of a fantasy novel. All spires, wrought iron gates, a driveway lined with ancient oak trees. Guests mingled near the grand fountain in formal gowns and pressed tuxedos, their laughter light and effortless. I stepped out hesitantly, adjusting my navy blue dress, a modest second-hand number I'd bought years ago for a college event. No designer tag, no pearls, just me. I tried to walk confidently, but eyes were already on me. A few whispered, one woman actually sneered. At the entrance stood a man in ceremonial red uniform, clipboard in hand. "Name?" he asked briskly. "Alara Wren." I replied. He paused, flipped a page, and looked up. "I'm sorry you're not on the list. Please wait outside." My throat tightened. Guests behind me chuckled quietly. I stepped aside and stood awkwardly near the steps, humiliated, confused. Was this a cruel joke? Had someone invited me just to shame me? Then the massive oak doors creaked open again. 2 guards emerged. No, not just guards. They were dressed like palace sentinels, gleaming white armor edged with gold, crimson sashes across their chests. They marched past the crowd, stopped in front of me, and one of them said in a firm, resonant voice, "Your Highness, apologies for the confusion. We've been expecting you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Someone dropped their champagne glass. I blinked. I asked, almost in a whisper. The guard nodded solemnly. Yes, Princess Alara. This way, please. The world spun. My feet moved on instinct as the guards escorted me up the steps and through the grand doors. The laughter stopped, the whispers turned into stunned silence. Inside, the estate was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers, floors of polished marble, stained, glass windows that painted the room in kaleidoscopic light. Every detail was immaculate, regal. At the far end of the hall stood a woman, all elegant, with silver hair pinned into a crown, like braid. Her emerald green dress shimmered with embroidery shaped like ancient symbols. And her presence was undeniable. Welcome home, she said softly. I froze. I'm sorry, do we know each other? The woman smiled faintly. We do, or rather we should. I am Queen Alaris of Dorythia, and you, child, are my sister's daughter, the last living heir of the Wren royal line. Time seemed to stop. I laughed one. Awkward, shaky. I think there's been some mistake. There is no mistake, she said gently, walking closer. You were hidden for your safety, smuggled away during the revolution. We searched for years, and now, finally, you've returned. I work in a bookstore, I live in a shared flat, I can barely afford rent. And yet you stood here with the grace of someone born into legacy. She replied, it's in your blood, the way you carry yourself, the instinct to speak only when it matters. But why now? Because the prophecy said the Wren line would rise again at the dawn of summer. And you, Ilara, arrived on the first day of midsummer. Before I could argue further, she placed something in my hand, a ring. Silver thin, set with an opal that shimmered with impossible colors. This was your mother's, she whispered, it recognizes you. As soon as my skin touched it, the stone pulsed warmly, the guards bowed again. I stared at them. This can't be real. The queen stepped back. It is, and now you must decide what to do with it. My mind was reeling. Just a few hours ago, I was a nobody, waiting outside like I didn't belong. Now I stood inside a palace, a ring on my finger, eyes on me like I was the missing piece to an ancient puzzle. And for the first time in my life, I felt something new, belonging. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing. My story was just beginning. The rain had just started to fall when I stepped away from the giant mahogany doors of the Davenport estate, shivering slightly in my modest coat. A thin mist clung to the stone steps as my cousins walked past me in gowns and tuxedos, laughing, clinking glasses, pretending they hadn't just told me to wait outside until someone came for me. Someone, as if I were a delivery or forgotten errand boy, not a blood relative. The gall of it all still burned inside me, but I kept my expression blank, my back straight, as I sat down on the low stone wall just beyond the hedge. Inside that mansion, my family's so-called legacy dinner was in full swing, an annual event where the Davenports gathered to celebrate their lineage, wealth, and royal bloodline. Ever since I was a child, I knew I was the outsider. My father, the second son of a viscount, had fallen in love with a woman the family didn't approve of. My mother, an orphan with no title or property. They never forgave him for it. When both my parents died in a car accident when I was 10, they took me in not out of love, but out of obligation. They fed me, clothed me, and sent me to their private schools, but never once let me forget that I didn't truly belong. Tonight, it became clear that they'd grown tired of even the pretense. I was invited under the guise of reconnecting, but it was just a formality, a performance. Aunt Cecilia had said it outright when I arrived. We thought it might be good for the optics if you were seen here, but do try to stay out of the way. Then she turned to the valet and said, he doesn't need to be inside, not yet. And so I waited. Wet, cold, humiliated, but they didn't know everything. For the last year and a half, I'd been working with a genealogist who specialized in noble lineages. It started as curiosity, a desire to understand more about my father's side of the family, to reclaim something, maybe. What I discovered shook everything I thought I knew. Turns out, my grandmother Lady Margaret had a secret marriage before she wed Lord Davenport. That first marriage had produced a child, a daughter. She'd been quietly adopted out to avoid scandal, but legally she remained in the line of succession to the Davenport estate. That daughter was my mother. It meant that I wasn't some distant cousin from a forgotten side branch. I was the rightful heir. Even more startling, documents recently uncovered by the firm showed that Lady Margaret, before she died, had legally updated her will to name her daughter and her daughter's descendants as direct successors, bypassing the current Viscount entirely. The will had been suppressed, hidden in the family archives, illegally, but now I had copies, not just documents, video testimony, notarized declarations, sealed DNA reports. The lawyers said my claim was not only valid, it was bulletproof. But I hadn't told them yet. I was waiting for tonight. The rain thickened. Just as I stood to leave, unwilling to endure another second of this, a sleek black car pulled up, tires whispering over the wet gravel. The driver stepped out and approached me. "Are you Mr. Elias Ashworth?" I nodded. He opened the door with a gloved hand. "They're ready for you." Inside was a woman I didn't recognize, tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp eyes and a clipped accent. She introduced herself as Lady Danbury, representative of the Royal Peerage Confirmation Office. "The Royal Registrar has accepted your claim, Mr. Ashworth," she said, handing me a slim envelope. "Your presence tonight has been officially acknowledged by the Crown. Your formal recognition will be announced in due time, but the seal has already been placed." I blinked. "Already." She smiled. "You're no longer an observer, Mr. Ashworth. You are a direct claimant, and from this moment forward no one may bar you from your birthright." My mind spun as the car pulled forward to the mansion. In front of the estate, a long black sedan was parked. From it emerged two uniformed men, members of the Royal Guard. I hadn't even known they would be here. The guard at the door stepped aside as we approached. "We'll announce you inside." The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and golden light. My cousins froze as I entered, flanked by Lady Danbury and the guards. Aunt Cecilia dropped her champagne glass. "What's going on?" she hissed, her voice rising. Lady Danbury stepped forward. "By order of the Peerage Office and under the Royal Succession Protocol of 1902, I present to you the direct and legitimate heir to the Davenport estate and legacy, Mr. Elias Ashworth, recognized descendant of Lady Margaret's firstborn." There was silence, absolute, suffocating silence, until one of the guards cleared his throat and said it. "Your Highness, your seat awaits." Aunt Cecilia turned gray. Uncle Gregory choked on his wine. And I simply smiled, because they had told me to wait outside, because they thought I'd stay quiet, because for years they had laughed behind closed doors while I listened from the shadows, but not anymore. They would learn that the blood they dismissed was the very blood that now sat at the head of the table. They would learn what it meant to underestimate someone who remembered everything, and they would learn that titles mean nothing if you don't live with honor. As the doors closed behind me with a quiet thud, the heavy silence that followed was louder than any applause. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, now stood still. My cousins, who had just moments earlier been bragging about business deals and yacht parties, were frozen mid-sentence. My aunts, adorned in their pearls and judgmental smirks, looked as if they'd just seen a ghost, one they never expected to walk back in, let alone as the rightful heir. The music came to a slow halt, as if even the quartet realized something had drastically changed. At the far end of the hall, the long banquet table reserved for family elders looked like a throne room in chaos. Uncle Gregory's face had gone red, veins bulging from his neck as he attempted to stand without knocking over his chair. Aunt Cecilia clutched her pearls, her mouth opening and closing but producing no words. But it was Cousin Edwin who spoke first, his voice carrying the same entitled arrogance that had tormented me since childhood. "This is a joke, right? He can't be serious." Before I could answer, Lady Danbury stepped in with the quiet authority of a sword unsheathed. "Mr. Ashworth has arrived per the instructions of the Peerage Confirmation Office. His status is recognized by the Crown, and any objections you might have should be directed through the royal chancery, not through petty outbursts. The guards standing behind me remained composed, but I saw one of them glance subtly at Edwin. The message was clear. Any move would be met with swift action. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted them to feel each step of my arrival. Every time they passed me over, every time they made me feel small, every snide remark, every invitation they forgot to send, every time they called me the spare, the charity case, the orphan boy, I had carried it all. And now I returned it, step by deliberate step. I'm not here for vengeance, I said, once I reached the head chair. I'm here because this is mine, because my mother was your blood, even if you denied her existence, because Lady Margaret, your mother, your grandmother, chose to right a wrong before she died, and because your attempts to bury the truth only fertilized it. Gregory pounded a fist on the table. That's slander. My mother would never. I have her will. I interrupted calmly, producing a slim folder and setting it down on the table. Not the altered one that you filed with the estate, the real one, dated and notarized in Geneva 5 weeks before her passing, along with her signed confession about her first child, my mother, and why she was hidden. Cecilia lunged forward. You forged it. This is some kind of scam. I expected you to say that. I said, flipping open the folder to reveal the royal seal and the letter of authenticity from the peerage office. The Crown reviewed every document. Lady Margaret's personal journals, the adoption papers, even the DNA test results that link me directly to the Davenport line. Gasps filled the room. One of my older cousins, Marissa, whispered to her husband, "It's true. I saw the records. I thought they were rumors." Silence. Lady Danbury said firmly, "This is not a debate. The Royal Registry has ruled." A sharp click echoed as the Royal Guard's commander stepped forward. "By the authority vested in us, we hereby recognize Elias Ashworth as the direct descendant of Lady Margaret's eldest child and rightful claimant to the Davenport legacy." You could feel the balance of power shift in that moment. The Davenports, for all their arrogance and social standing, were nothing more than a paper empire, and paper burns fast under the heat of truth. Gregory looked at me, face twitching between rage and desperation. "What do you want, Elias? Huh? You want money, the house. You want to humiliate us." I stared at him, steady. "I want acknowledgement. I want the truth to be spoken aloud, not buried. I want my mother's name cleared, her legacy restored, and I want you all to feel, just for one moment, what it was like to be cast aside." A long pause followed before I continued. "But I'm not here to destroy this family. I could. Legally, I could liquidate assets, reclaim lands, and have all of you removed from the estate trust, but I won't." They blinked in confusion. "I'm offering a new chapter," I said. "One where truth matters more than perception, where lineage is not decided by manipulation. I won't forget what you did, but I won't repeat it." Behind me, Lady Danbury nodded approvingly. Still, not everyone was ready to accept peace. Edwin, ever the brat in a man's suit, laughed bitterly. "Even if this is real, you'll never be accepted. You think these people, society, parliament, the royal circles, will ever treat you like one of us. You're an outsider, Elias, always have been. I may have been born on the outside," I said, but I walked in through the front door, while you were too busy watching your reflection to notice the future arrive. A low murmur swept through the room, and for once it wasn't disdain, it was acknowledgement. Some faces looked ashamed, others surprised, and a few, just a few, looked hopeful. Then came the moment that would seal everything. The lead royal guard stepped toward me and held out a velvet box. Inside was the official insignia of the Davenport peerage, a gold and emerald brooch crafted in 1853, reserved only for the direct heir. I took it, held it for a second, and then pinned it to my lapel. The room exhaled as one. "Shall we dine?" I said calmly, gesturing for the servers to resume, and just like that, I took my seat. Not as a guest, not as an afterthought, not as a charity case, but as the future of the Davenport legacy, and they could finally see what they had almost erased. That night, long after the guests had gone and the chandeliers dimmed to a regal glow, I found myself alone in Lady Margaret's study, the very room where, according to her personal journals, she'd made the final decision to acknowledge my mother, and, by extension, me. The room smelled of polished oak and lavender wax, and the grand portrait above the fireplace of a much younger Lady Margaret seemed to watch me with quiet pride. I stood by the bay windows, looking out over the moonlit gardens she had once written about, trying to reconcile the boy who used to sit outside the estate gates with the man who now stood at its helm. I expected to feel triumphant, to feel the sweet vindication of justice, but instead I felt heavy. The truth had set many things right, but it had also shattered illusions. Family was not supposed to be this cruel. Blood was not supposed to treat you like a stain. Yet here I was, left to rebuild a legacy I had never asked for, brick by broken brick. A knock pulled me from my thoughts. I turned, expecting perhaps Lady Danbury or one of the royal aides. But it was Aunt Cecilia standing in the doorway, not with her usual air of disdain, but looking oddly human. Unadorned, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shawl. "May I come in?" she asked softly. I nodded, unsure what game she might be playing, but she stepped inside without her usual pomp, instead walking slowly to one of the leather chairs by the fire and sinking into it, as if age had finally caught up to her. "I used to sit here," she said, her voice almost a whisper, when Margaret would write letters or take her tea. I thought I knew everything about her. I stayed silent, giving her space. She always said the Davenports must be preserved, that the name mattered, the honor, the legacy, but what she didn't say was that she had regrets, deep ones. I read the journal, I read it all. There was a long pause before she met my eyes. She loved your mother, in her own way, and she hated herself for letting Gregory and I convince her to keep it secret. We said it would destroy the family. What we didn't realize was that the silence was what truly damaged it. I folded my arms. "So now you come to apologize." "I came to admit I was wrong," she said plainly. "I told Margaret that your mother was a liability, that you were nothing more than an accident, but you showed up with more dignity than anyone else in that ballroom tonight, and I saw it on Gregory's face, on Edwin's. You're not just blood, you're royalty in spirit." That last line surprised me. "I don't need you to bow," I said after a moment, "but I need you to stand beside me if we're going to fix what's broken." She nodded slowly, eyes moist. "Then let's begin." The days that followed were surreal. The estate became a headquarters of sorts. Royal emissaries, family trustees, even media representatives requested meetings. There were headlines, some respectful, others scandalous, but I stayed grounded. Lady Danbury advised me wisely, steering me through the bureaucratic maze of inheritance, title confirmation, and public narrative. But the real work was behind closed doors. One by one, family members began coming forward, not all and not always kindly. Some still doubted, some scoffed behind their wine glasses, but some apologized sincerely, including my cousin Marissa, who offered to help restore my mother's portrait in the family gallery. Others simply watched, waiting for me to fail. I didn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, I did what none of them expected. I hosted a gathering, not a ball, not a dinner, but a reconciliation. I invited every family member, no matter their opinion of me. I invited their staff, their spouses, their children, and I opened the evening not with a toast, but with a reading from Lady Margaret's final letter to me, one no one else had ever seen. She had written, "Elias, you carry not just our blood, but the strength I never found the courage to show. You are not my shame, you are my redemption, and I pray that when they see you walk these halls, they will see me too, not the woman who chose silence, but the woman who finally chose truth." When I looked up from the letter, the room was silent. A few people were crying. Even Gregory, seated at the back, looked as if he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I closed the letter. I am not here to erase anyone, but I am here to make sure no one else gets erased again. From that night onward, everything changed. Cecilia began volunteering with a foundation I launched in my mother's name, supporting children separated from their heritage. Gregory stepped down from his role in the estate's management without a fight. Edwin disappeared to Europe for an extended reflection retreat, and I moved into the West Wing, just across from Lady Margaret's former chambers. I kept her study exactly the same. I was invited to speak at Parliament later that month. The House of Lords extended a rare invitation to discuss lineage recognition reform. As I stood in that ancient hall, speaking not just for myself, but for countless others denied by silence and pride, I felt the full weight of the moment. And after the applause, after the formalities, as I descended the steps outside Westminster, a man in full ceremonial uniform approached, bowed deeply, and said, "Your Highness, your car is ready." Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, but I smiled only for myself, because once they told me to wait outside. Now they held the doors open with a title I never needed to prove who I was. But it sure felt satisfying to hear them say it. "Your Highness, for the first time in my life, I felt what it was like to truly belong, not in a symbolic or honorary way, but tangibly, undeniably. After that fateful day at Westminster and the words, 'Your Highness,' reverberated through every news outlet in the country, my life transformed. But not in the flashy fairy tale way people might expect. No, real change is quieter. It arrives in how people look at you, how doors stay open just a second longer, how silence gives way to curiosity instead of disdain." I began overseeing Lady Margaret's estate with the respect of the trustees and board, something unimaginable just months ago. I didn't throw out the old traditions, but I started gently reshaping them. For instance, I reinstated the estate's scholarship fund, something Lady Margaret had once supported in her youth, only to let it die under family pressure. This time it bore a new name, the Davenport Holloway Grant, in honor of my mother. That name on the letterhead shocked many, but I made no apologies. She had been hidden long enough. The first group of applicants were young girls, many from backgrounds my family once considered undesirable. And during the selection committee's meeting, when some distant cousin tried to question a candidate based on her family history, I shut it down firmly. "We don't judge people by where they came from," I said, "only by where they're determined to go." The room fell silent, but no one argued. Aunt Cecilia, surprisingly, became a quiet ally. She didn't attend every meeting, nor did she throw praise my way. But when the board tried to overturn my decision to expand the estate's community access program, she was the only one to vote in my favor. "It's time we stop guarding empty halls and start opening doors," she said, and I saw in her a version of the woman she might have been all along, one who wasn't afraid to go against the grain. Meanwhile, my public image grew. I became a regular guest on heritage panels and civil history discussions. People were fascinated by the so-called hidden royal narrative, but I was careful not to let it become a circus. For every interview I agreed to, I turned down 5. I didn't want to be a tabloid prince. I wanted to be a bridge, a symbol that tradition and truth didn't have to be at odds. But not everyone celebrated this transformation. Gregory had retreated, yes, but not without attempting to undermine me from the shadows. Anonymous stories began surfacing online. Rumors about my mother's past, about whether I had fabricated documents, even questions about my academic qualifications. It didn't take long to trace those stories back to a PR firm linked to one of Gregory's business allies. I considered confronting him, but then I remembered something Lady Danbury told me over tea. "Let dogs bark. You focus on building the kingdom." Instead of fighting, I kept moving forward. We held a gala to unveil a new art wing at the Estate Museum, dedicated to untold royal stories. A series of portraits featuring unsung women who had contributed to the kingdom's history was its centerpiece. The final painting, my mother hand, painted from an old photograph I kept in my wallet. When it was unveiled, there was a beat of silence in the room. No gasps, no applause, just reverence. One of the older trustees whispered, "It's time." Even the press took notice. Headlines shifted from speculation to admiration. One journalist wrote, "He didn't just change the family, he changed the narrative." But the real shift came during a private dinner held by the House of Lords. I had been invited alongside Cecilia, who was beginning to regain her stature among elite circles, albeit with a new humility. Midway through dinner, one lord raised his glass and said to the young man who waited outside, "And now has the keys to a kingdom of integrity." I could feel Cecilia glance at me from across the table, and this time there was no pride masking her expression, only quiet acknowledgement. But amidst all the formalities and the rise in recognition, there was one thing I hadn't yet done. I hadn't visited my mother's grave since all of this began. Her grave was simple, tucked into a quiet cemetery on the edge of the city. It bore no titles, no legacy, only her name and 2 dates etched without fanfare. I went alone, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she used to pick during our walks in the countryside. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the cold stone, and I whispered everything. The betrayals, the victories, the moment the royal guard called me Your Highness, the faces of those who doubted, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who finally spoke. And most importantly, I told her that her name now lived in places it had once been erased from, on walls, in books, on scholarships. "They say I'm royalty now," I added, my voice trembling. "But you always knew that, didn't you?" A breeze swept through the trees, and for a moment I felt her. Not in a mystical way, but in the grounded way memories wrap around us when we need them most. I left a letter at her grave, one I had written years ago when I first learned the truth about her lineage. I had written, "One day I'll walk into that house not as a mistake, but as the echo of your courage." And now I finally had. The next week, I hosted a special ceremony at the estate. It wasn't for royals or press. It was for the staff, many of whom had worked there for decades without acknowledgement. We unveiled new housing quarters, better pay structures, and I gave each long-term employee a handwritten letter of gratitude. Some wept, some simply nodded, but each of them walked away with something they'd never gotten before: recognition. That night, as I stood on the balcony overlooking the estate, I saw the lights below, warm, inviting, alive. And I realized something Lady Margaret never had the time to say in person, but had written between the lines of every entry. This wasn't just about legacy. It was about restoration, restoration of family, restoration of truth, restoration of self. And as I looked at the stars above the estate, I smiled, because the boy they once told to wait outside now stood inside, not as a guest, not even as royalty, but as a rightful heir to something bigger than a title. Heir to healing, heir to legacy, heir to a truth they could never silence again. In the weeks following the staff celebration, I found myself finally breathing in the air of something new, something earned. Though the estate still echoed with old portraits and older rules, the atmosphere had begun to shift. Even the housekeepers, who once glanced nervously whenever I passed, now offered warm smiles. The younger guards on the grounds no longer stiffened as if unsure how to address me. "Good morning, Your Highness," they would say with confidence, not hesitation. The title had settled into me, not as a crown, but as a second skin, woven with both pride and pain. I began waking up earlier, walking the gardens before breakfast. These grounds, once symbolic of everything I was shut out from, now felt like mine, not in a possessive way, but in a caretaker's way. I oversaw repairs to crumbling wings, commissioned local artists to restore forgotten tapestries, and opened sections of the manor to school groups. To the public, I was a progressive royal. But to myself, I was simply someone determined to make sure no one else ever felt like they had to wait outside again. I got a letter one day, handwritten, smudged, no return address. It simply read, "I watched you from the ballroom window that day. I should have said something. I'm sorry. No name, no clue, but I had a strong feeling it was from one of the family members who had been present when I was turned away. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The truth had already found its voice, and apologies were now the echoes behind me. But life had a way of testing even the strongest resolve. About a month later, I was invited, this time formally, to a royal summit hosted in the Scottish Highlands. It was an event for modern royals across Europe, intended to discuss charitable innovation, climate projects, and cultural preservation. To be invited was an acknowledgement of status, but to be expected to speak on behalf of your house was another level entirely. I was both honored and anxious. This was my first step into the international arena, and though I carried a title, I still bore the scars of exclusion. Aunt Cecilia traveled with me. She had become a quiet constant in my life, more of an advisor than a relative. In the car ride up, she told me something that stayed with me. You've done more in a few months than some of our ancestors did in lifetimes, but don't lose the one thing they never had: humility. When we arrived at the summit, I saw polished figures in tailored suits and crowns of state. Princes from Luxembourg, baronesses from Belgium, a countess from Denmark. They nodded in recognition, some politely, others with curiosity. I wasn't just the new face, I was the mystery, the story that made headlines for its break from tradition. I was seated next to a Swedish duchess named Astrid. She was sharp, witted, and kind. She leaned over during a panel and whispered, "Your family really tried to keep you hidden. That's wild." I nodded, not offended. She added, "Good thing they failed. You speak with purpose." Those words stuck with me, because for so long I didn't think my voice had space in rooms like this. My speech came on the second day. I stood before a room filled with royalty, media, and scholars. The moment I looked up from the podium and met the gaze of those who once seemed so unreachable, I felt something shift again. Not in them, but in me. I no longer felt like the outsider. I felt like the message itself. I was born with blood they didn't acknowledge. I began, but legacy isn't about who signs your birth certificate. It's about the impact you make when no one's watching. It's about the courage to claim your seat not out of entitlement, but out of truth. The room was silent, attentive. I was told to wait outside, not because I didn't belong, but because they feared I might, and I get it. Truth disrupts comfort, but disruption isn't the enemy, silence is. The applause that followed was not thunderous, but it was sincere. People stood. Some approached me afterward with gratitude, others with genuine interest in partnerships. But what struck me most was what happened that evening at dinner. A count from Spain, well known for his staunch traditionalism, raised a toast and said, "To the prince who didn't need a throne to prove his worth." That night, I called my mentor from university, Professor Alden. He'd been one of the few who knew my truth early on and always encouraged me to chase it. "It's happening," I told him, "everything I thought was impossible." He chuckled warmly on the phone. "That's because you stopped trying to fit into their mold and carved your own." When I returned home, I found a letter waiting, this time not anonymous. It was from Lady Margaret's old friend and legal advisor, Sir Edwin. He had been the one to first confirm the documents about my mother, the man who'd reluctantly told me the family's decision to hide her legacy. His note was short but powerful. "Forgiveness is earned. You earned mine. I only hope you find space to give yours to those who may come asking for it soon." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. But within days, I got another invitation, this one more personal. Gregory had requested a meeting in private. I wrestled with the idea. The cousin who had treated me like a stain, who spread lies, who inherited without hesitation, all while knowing the truth, wanted to talk. I met him in the library at the old family manor. He stood awkward and pale, no longer the confident figure I remembered. "I didn't call you here to fight," he began. "I didn't come to forgive." I replied evenly. He nodded, fair. He stared at a painting of our great-grandfather. I thought I was protecting the family, keeping the structure intact. I didn't know how much damage I was doing. "You didn't care." I corrected him. He didn't argue, he sighed. "Everything's changed. The board favors your leadership." The public respects you, the estate thrives under you, and, honestly, I don't know who I am in that world. I studied him. For the first time he didn't seem threatening, he seemed lost. You could be something better, I said, but you'd have to want it, earn it. He looked me in the eyes. Would you ever let me? I thought about it. About all the nights I'd cried, all the times I'd guessed myself, all the doors slammed in my face, and yet, here I was, not as a victim but as a choice maker. I don't owe you anything, Gregory, I said finally. But if you ever choose to become someone worthy of trust, not inheritance, not image, but trust, then maybe, we parted without handshakes or smiles, just a pause, maybe that was enough. Weeks later, as the royal family hosted their annual charity gala, I was invited again, this time not just as a guest but as co-host. I stood at the top of the grand staircase as the ballroom filled below. Cameras flashed, voices murmured, and then, as I made my entrance, the announcer said it clearly and confidently, "Now entering His Royal Highness, Prince Alexander of Holloway." My eyes met the same guards who once blocked the door. They saluted. I smiled, because I didn't need to be let in anymore. I already belonged. As I stood at the edge of the ballroom that night, watching dignitaries mingle beneath chandeliers that once illuminated a world I was kept out of, I realized how much had changed, and how much I had changed along with it. The boy who once sat alone outside the gates, feeling forgotten and unworthy, had grown into a man who no longer sought validation from the ones who overlooked him. Instead, I had created a space where truth led the way and legacy was something you built, not inherited. The journey wasn't easy. Every step forward came with a memory of rejection. Every accolade was laced with the echo of old wounds, but it was those very wounds that shaped my strength. I no longer resented being told to wait outside. I saw it now for what it was, the moment I began building my own door. I had once believed that bloodlines defined destiny, that being born into a family meant you would be loved, supported, embraced. But the reality was that some doors remained closed not because we lacked value, but because those inside feared change. What I learned was this: if they won't open the door, build your own entrance. And when you walk through, do so with purpose, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself that you were always worthy. My relationship with the family remained polite but distant. Some members reached out in quiet acknowledgement, others remained silent in their guilt or pride. And that was okay. I didn't need all of them. I didn't need their apologies or their approval. What I needed was peace, and I found it not in their arms, but in the arms of those who stood by me when I had nothing to offer but truth. Layla, the Duchess of Eastmere, who publicly embraced me as a cousin when no one else did. Professor Alden, who encouraged me when my name carried no titles. Aunt Cecilia, who gave me space to speak when others silenced me. And countless others, friends, staff, even strangers, who believed in what I stood for. The palace walls no longer towered above me. I walked them now with my head high, not because I was better, but because I was finally seen. I established a scholarship fund in my mother's name for students from underrepresented families in royal and diplomatic history studies. I partnered with youth leadership initiatives, and my office created one of the first diversity frameworks for royal institutions. I was no longer just a story. They had made me a symbol, and I chose what kind of symbol to be, not one of revenge but of resilience. And sometimes when I passed the very door where I was once told to wait outside, I stopped, not out of bitterness but to remember. Because every great rise begins in a quiet moment of refusal, a moment when the world says no, and you choose to say yes to yourself. I had waited outside for too long. Now the world was listening. And I was finally home.